The aim of this investigation was to support other evidentiary information presented in the case for genocide and crimes against humanity, committed against the Ixil people in a series of trials taking place in Guatemala, including the retrial of former dictator Efraín Ríos Montt and other senior military staff in the National Court of Guatemala. Forensic Architecture's research into the Guatemalan Civil War focused on the violence inflicted by state security forces, both military forces and military organized civil militias. Guatemala is ruptured by one of the world's most active geological fault lines, making a belt of extreme topography that runs across the country from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean. It is the distinct geological conditions of Guatemala that organized and sequenced the 5-century-long process of colonization and also the logic of the Civil War. Between 1960 and 1996, Guatemala suffered one of the longest and most brutal of the dirty wars that ravaged Latin America during the Cold War. Our research focused on the western highlands of Guatemala, where the Ixil Maya people live. Throughout the Civil War, this area suffered the harshest results of military violence. We focused our attention on the period of the early 1980s, when the violence of the Civil War intensified into a genocide of the Ixil. The campaign was particularly intense in the area the military referred to as the Ixil Triangle.
These are the three major cities of the Ixil territory: Neba, Quetzal, and Chahul. Based on this geometric figure formed by the location of the cities, the military named this entire area as the Ixil Triangle.
Like other Maya people across the mountain ranges of Guatemala, the Ixil villages were usually built in small clearings, within the otherwise dense cloud forests. Small fields of beans and maize were scattered in the narrow valleys between the steep and heavily forested ranges. The forests were considered to be social commons and were maintained and cultivated together by families that shared the produce. Further, the cosmology of the Ixils conceived the mountains and the forest as sacred spaces, living entities possessing their own form of agency. This pattern of inhabitation, protected by the steep mountains and connected only by poor roads, allowed indigenous communities to maintain a semi-autonomous life. By the early 1970s, guerrilla groups started to set base within the forests of the Ixil region. In February 1976, a devastating earthquake hit Guatemala. The military used the relief effort in order to establish military bases for operations in the Western Highlands.
By the end of the 70s, all this region was occupied by a series of military bases. So in those red squares, what we see are the locations of the military detachments that were installed in this region throughout the 70s.
Cuando la inteligencia militar detectaba un pueblo en la cual creía que había movimientos guerrilleros, y claro, en muchos de ellos sí lo sabían, siempre tenían en mente de que tales, decían con nombre de una vez, tal pueblo desde la colonización siempre fue renuente al Estado, fue un grupo bastante rebelde y que son un peligro.
The semi-autonomous life of the Ixils, their withdrawal from the state and its national identity, made the military see these areas as posing a greater threat than that which they actually posed. During 1982 to 83, when Ríos Montt was in power, the military considered the entire population of the Ixil region as collaborators of the guerrilla. In these remote highlands of this region, the military set out to exterminate what it considered to be the social base of guerrilla support.
He tenido acceso a documentos muy importantes del mismo ejército y logro ver que realmente había un plan para arrasar con pueblos indígenas.
In the early 1980s, the government's counterinsurgency campaign, saw the widespread deployment of what it referred to as scorched earth offensives. In the wake of mass slaughters, the military went on destroying hundreds of indigenous villages, agricultural fields, and livestock. It was the destruction not only of thousands of civilian lives, but also of a landscape that supported a way of life.
Yellow points mark places where massacres, collective killings have taken place during the early 80s. Massacres started really around the major municipalities of the Ixil Triangle and spread out in the remote villages scattered in between the folds of the mountains. Massacres have been committed more than once. Here, 5 massacres were located. So the military was really coming back in order to certify that the population was not inhabiting this area anymore and really unleashing a wave of terror that swiped the entire Ixil territory. The white squares marked places where communities have been destroyed, villages have been destroyed by the military. Together, in parallel with the massacres, either before or after a massacre had been committed, the military went on destroying the entire material infrastructure based on which the life of the indigenous population was sustained. This included the destruction of houses, public buildings, but not only, also the destruction of agricultural fields, the killing of animals, and large-scale deforestation. So it's really perceptible that massacres were almost always followed or are very closely located to the destruction of the villages.
One of the main methodologies involved physically trekking through the forest. In attempting to identify the larger areas within which building remains are located, we learned from our hosts to follow the plants. The density and distribution of plant types is an archaeological resource which indexes traces of human presence.
En cualquier lugar hacen una nivelación del terreno, porque por lo regular es quebrado, o sea, partes planas totalmente no hay. Entonces, allá se ve, o sea, los restos de ese corte. Y aquí el temazcal que siembra, eso es un indicador así clave para poder localizar. Y aparte de eso, los palos de aguacate, por ejemplo, palos de aguacate o palos de durazno, como son más domésticos, ¿verdad? Entonces están en patios de casas, ¿verdad? O cercano a casas. Y esos son indicadores también de dónde pudo haber existido una casa. O sea, si ellos no vinieran con nosotros, esto es clave. Del daño de vapor.
The cloud forest accelerated the disintegration of all the organic materials composing the destroyed and burned homes. After 30 years, all that remained were small elevated earthworks, their stone foundations often overgrown with shrubs. Sometimes we had to probe the ground to identify the harder surfaces below that could designate these foundations. When finding such foundations, we had to clear away the plants with a machete before photographing and sometimes measuring the remains.
Aquí este cuarto tiene 8 por 4. Ahí está el corredor. Ahí está el corredor. Tiene como 10 varas de largo. 10 por 8. Tiene un caso de grande, tiene su corredor de 2 varas. Aquí vivimos antes de 1982.
As a part of its counterinsurgency efforts, the military collected, deported, and resettled the survivors of the massacres in specially designed and militarized refugee camps, which were also places of forced labor located at the edges of major towns. This was followed by a developmental phase in which the military resettled the survivors in newly built model villages and agricultural modernization programs were implemented.
What we see here pointed in light blue are the new settlements that the military built in parallel or just following the massacres. So there is clearly a process of destruction marked in yellow and a process of reconstruction of settlements that you can see in blue.
Llegaban al ejército y los recluían en esos puntos, o el ejército con sus helicópteros y la tropa andaba buscándolos en las montañas, los capturan y los traen. Entonces son bolsos de reductos de población en la cual recibían entrenamiento militar y además pláticas anticomunistas, pláticas contra todo tipo de organización, todo un campo donde se les cambió la mentalidad de los grupos Ixiles, ¿no? Sí, hay pueblos, le llaman pueblos de desarrollo, ¿no?
These model villages resembled refugee camps and were similarly regimented. They were built in sites adjacent to, sometimes on top of, destroyed villages deemed strategic spots. The presence of military bases nearby also meant that these concentration villages could be kept under close military control. The model villages were part of a larger process of territorial reorganization conducted by the armed forces.
En arqueología decimos el patrón de asentamiento. El patrón de asentamiento en las comunidades mayas es disperso, ¿verdad? Una casa por acá, otra casa por acá, en medio campos de maíz, y todo está despejado. Con las aldeas modelo, lo que pasa es que se juntan todas las casas y viven uno a la par del otro para tenerlos mejor controlados. Entonces, cambias materialmente la cultura porque ya no vivís igual, ya vivís a la par, ya vivís como ellos quieren que vivas, y también cambias la cultura en términos de el sistema ideológico de la cultura. Cómo pensás, cómo concebís el mundo, comienza a cambiarse en los polos de desarrollo.
Together, all these actions amounted to an attempt to radically transform the ways of life of the Ixil, to erode their political and cultural autonomy in order to bring them under the rule of the state. It was thus with the combination of massacres with the reorganization of the landscape, economy, and ways of life within these areas that the Guatemalan military set out to break the political natural bonds between communities and their land. In such a manner, they aimed to destroy the basis of the existence of the Ixil people as a distinctive culture. Our research aims to complement an understanding of genocide as the destruction of people with a spatial understanding. Studying the transformation of the built and natural environment, we had to cross-reference the results of ground investigation with satellite data. We employed a technology called Normalized Difference Vegetation Index, or NDVI. NDVI is a graphical indicator that is used to visualize and interpret transformations in vegetation cover over time. We used two satellite images, an image taken by NASA's Earth observation satellite in 1979, just before the massacres began, and one captured in 1986, after the peak of the massacres. When two or more satellite photographs are superimposed, the NDVI data can demonstrate changes in the natural environment between the dates of capture. The color of each pixel in the image indicates whether the area within the pixel lost or gained in vegetation cover. Green indicates vegetation gain over time, and red indicates vegetation loss.
In red, you see areas that had been deforested during this period. In green, in light green, you see areas that have gained vegetation cover during this period. So there is a radical transformation in patterns of land cover that follow the military campaign. You can perceive that areas in red mark, for example, around new built settlements, as for example Acul, Atsumbao, as well as increasing urbanization around the major urban nodes, San Juan Chahul, San Gaspar Cotzal, and Neba. Therefore, insofar as refugees were being relocated to these areas, you can see that there was a more concentrated urban pattern, right? And therefore the deforestation. In other areas, deforestation indicates somehow the opposite event, the displacement of the population, as for example here. You can see that these areas that had lost vegetation cover are really related to sites of massacres, death by displacement and destruction of villages, as well as sites from where refugees were displaced. So there are indications of the scorched earth offensives, the destruction of forests, the destruction of agricultural fields committed by military forces. The areas highlighted in light green indicate precisely the opposite, areas which had gained vegetation cover. Most probably these are lands that were agricultural fields cultivated by farmers that had been taken over by the wild during those years. So those green little spots really mark, they are really traces of the absence of those families that had to be displaced or that were killed by the military offensives.
The transformation of the natural, the built, and military violence went hand in hand. The map is an attempt to establish the spatial and temporal relation between otherwise separate bits of evidence. But the direct violence of massacres must be complemented by an understanding of the slower, though no less lethal, consequences of environmental violence. The presentation of environmental violence would eventually demand other forms of justice, not only the indictment of specific individuals, but rather a search for ways to transform the lethal force fields on which the state of Guatemala still rests. Our work thus comes to complement the knowledge gathered by the forensic anthropological research undertaken by the FAFG and other groups in the area of the Ixil territory. After digging out common and individual graves, these groups undertook a process of identification of the bodies by means of DNA analysis, in order to collect evidence both for trials and in order to allow the bodies to be returned to their families for reburial. Most of the bodies exhumed in the Ixil territories recorded the hard violence of physical trauma, machete wounds, burn marks, or bullet holes. Most of the forensic archaeologists undertaking exhumations since the end of the Civil War were trained in the archaeology of the pre-Hispanic Mayan civilization. Excavating for graves dating from the Ixil campaign revealed also fragments of the pre-Columbian past, pointing not only to the area's continuous inhabitation over an extended period, but to a genocidal continuum of colonial history.
You can see they are really white because they are exposed to the sun. Mm-hmm. But it's still, it's very hard, still the bones. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So
these are Civil War bones?
Could be.
So how do you explain the connection between the kind of pre-Columbian history?
It's everywhere.
Historian Greg Grandin referred to the Guatemala campaign of the 1980s as the last colonial massacre, situating it as the culmination of a 5-century-long process of colonization, land grab and massacres suffered by the indigenous people in the Americas.
Bueno, entonces vamos para que ustedes tengan una idea, para que ustedes empiecen a ver cómo es un debate, vamos a presentarles un poco del debate de un juicio donde se juzgó a un excomisionado militar por 6 ejecuciones, por 6 desapariciones forzadas. Y vamos a ver un juicio también donde se condenó a expatrulleros civiles también y a unos soldados porque mataron a más de 200 personas en 1982 también. Para que ustedes tengan una idea de cómo es un juicio y para que eso los vaya preparando al momento que les toque asistir a ese juicio.
Before the research was concluded on May the 10th, 2013, Ríos Montt was convicted of genocide and crimes against humanity. The court found that under his regime, the Ixils were considered to be public enemies of the state and were also victims of racism, and sentenced Montt to 80 years in prison. The Constitutional Court of Guatemala overturned the conviction on May the 20th, 2013, and forced a retrial. As the economy of the Ixils was largely dependent upon subsistence farming, and forests were a key source of energy in this remote region, deforestations and the destruction of crops effectively made large parts of the territory uninhabitable. In the Guatemalan highlands, in the time span covered by our research, environmental violence included the twin acts of destruction and construction. Both were manifestations of an attempt to reorganize the territory to suit the aims of military and state control. We studied the environment as neither the background nor the location of conflict, but rather as an entity in constant interaction with conflict. As long as people believe that the existing environment, mountains and forests for example, conditions the way conflicts unfold, the environment will bear the brunt of violence and become the means by which resistance is put down.